Imagine the streets of London in the summer of 1305. The air, heavy with the scent of baked bread and soot, echoed with the cries of merchants and the clatter of horseshoes on cobblestones. But on this August morning, another sound rose to dominate the city, the restless roar of a crowd hungry not for goods, but for blood. They had gathered for a spectacle, one unlike any other. Word had spread that William Wallace, the infamous Scottish rebel, had been captured and brought to face the Crown's justice. But justice was a generous word for what awaited him. What was to unfold that day was not merely an execution, but a public ritual of terror, choreographed to break both body and spirit, not just of Wallace, but of anyone who dared dream of freedom. Wallace's final hours have often been softened by legend, romanticized by films and ballads. Braveheart, they call him, a hero who met his end with nobility and resolve. But the truth, as raw as the gallows that awaited him, was far darker. King Edward I of England, known to history as Longshanks, was not content with merely killing Wallace. He intended to erase him, to turn the man into a warning, visceral, unforgettable, permanent. The method chosen was the most brutal in England's judicial arsenal: hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved for traitors, designed to destroy the body in stages and annihilate the soul in public view. This was medieval justice at its most theatrical and cruel. It wasn't about ending Wallace's life, it was about obliterating his legacy, making him an example so horrific that no one would dare follow his path. But to truly understand why Wallace met such a fate, we must first return to the land and time that forged him. Scotland at the end of the 13th century was a nation teetering between independence and submission. Its identity as a country was still taking shape, and loyalty was often a matter of survival. The death of King Alexander III had plunged Scotland into a succession crisis, and King Edward of England saw his opportunity. He positioned himself not as an ally but as an overlord, seeking to absorb Scotland as a vassal state. It was during this chaos that William Wallace emerged, not as a nobleman, not as a king, but as a common man transformed by grief and conviction, a minor landowner by birth. Wallace had suffered directly under English occupation. The loss of his family, whether through war or execution, fueled his transformation. At Stirling Bridge in 1297, Wallace struck back. His forces dealt a stunning blow to the English army, proving that even the might of English heavy cavalry could falter before a determined resistance. But Edward Longshanks was not a monarch who tolerated defiance. He had crushed Welsh rebellions with iron fists, expelled Jews from England, and ruled with a mind sharpened by conquest. To him, Wallace was not a rebel, he was a fire that had to be extinguished, a symbol that had to be dismantled, piece by piece, in the most public way imaginable. What Wallace stood for, freedom, dignity, resistance, could not be allowed to survive him. Out of the smoldering uncertainty of a broken Scotland, a figure emerged, not clad in royal robes or sanctioned by noble birth, but wrapped in the quiet fury of a man who had lost everything. William Wallace was no king. He had no title, no grand estate, but what he did possess, and what would terrify England, was a relentless will. He fought not for crowns, but for a people, for the soul of a nation that did not yet fully exist. In the wake of English occupation, Wallace was driven by grief sharpened into vengeance, by injustice transformed into action. His legend began in earnest at Stirling Bridge, 1297, a moment etched into the memory of Scotland like fire into flesh. With fewer men, little armor, and far less formal training, Wallace orchestrated a devastating blow to the English. As enemy cavalry attempted to cross the narrow wooden bridge, Wallace's forces attacked with precision and ferocity. The bridge collapsed beneath the weight of arrogance, and the English army crumbled. That victory wasn't just military, it was mythic. It told a fractured people that resistance was not futile, that freedom wasn't some poetic notion, it could be seized, with blood, grit, and vision. For a moment, Wallace was not just a commander, he was guardian of Scotland. title not granted by kings, but by the people and by the force of necessity. Under his leadership, Scotland reclaimed not just land, but a sliver of self-respect. But glory is a fragile thing. As the months passed, Wallace's movement, though fierce, found itself outnumbered, out-financed, and politically isolated. Many Scottish nobles, calculating their survival, chose submission over defiance, swearing fealty to Edward in exchange for titles, land, or simple mercy. Wallace, unrelenting and uncompromising, stood increasingly alone. His refusal to bend made him a hero to the people, and an inconvenience to the elite, both English and Scottish. To the English crown, Wallace became something worse than an enemy. He became a symbol, a ghost in the hills, a name that whispered rebellion in every town and glen. He was no longer just a man, he was the idea of resistance made flesh. That made him dangerous, that made him unacceptable. King Edward knew this. Longshanks had a reputation for methodical suppression, not just of armies, but of culture, of spirit. He didn't just want to kill Wallace, he wanted to erase his influence, to shatter the idea that a common man could inspire a kingdom. And so began the hunt, not for a warrior, but for a legend. Edward placed a price on Wallace's head so large it turned allies into informants and patriots into betrayers. A vast web of spies, collaborators, and private opportunists closed in. Slowly, step by step, Wallace's world narrowed. Roads he once knew became trapped. Voices he once trusted grew silent. The fire still burned within him, but the shadows were growing. Then came August, 1305. Near Glasgow, he was captured. The betrayal is believed to have come from Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot who had sworn loyalty to England. Whether out of fear, greed, or an exhaustion, Menteith handed over Scotland's most wanted man. The exact details remain clouded, but the outcome was certain. William Wallace had fallen. And yet, the story was only just beginning. They did not just capture a man, they captured a legend. And legends, when shackled, must be broken slowly. After his betrayal near Glasgow, William Wallace was taken under heavy guard. But this was no ordinary transport. His journey south was not a transfer, but a parade, a carefully crafted ritual of humiliation, choreographed to sap the will not just from Wallace, but from every soul that once believed in him. From the hills of Scotland to the heart of London, he was dragged through town after town. In each village, the English authorities made sure that the people saw his face. Broken and bloody, the crowd pointed, children whispered, grown men laughed. To the crown, this was psychological warfare, the slow death of a symbol. They didn't torture him with blades, not yet. They tortured him with silence, with chains, with the knowledge that he had become an exhibit in a royal museum of cruelty. By the time he reached London, Wallace had already endured weeks of slow erosion, but the worst, the performance Edward had long planned, was still to come. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was brought before a tribunal at Westminster Hall, a grand chamber more suited to pomp than justice. There would be no defense, no jury of peers. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely didn't understand, but that hardly mattered. The outcome had been scripted from the moment of his arrest. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, and arson, a long scroll of crimes against the English crown. The irony echoed through the hall like distant thunder. Wallace was being condemned for betraying a king he had never sworn loyalty to. And when given the chance to speak, he stood, weary, chained, but unbowed, and said words that would ring through time. I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject. It was a statement of defiance, a final refusal to kneel, and for that, his fate was sealed even tighter than before. The trial was not about justice, it was about vengeance and performance. Every aspect of the sentence was symbolic. He would be drawn through the streets, stripped of dignity, hanged. But not until dead, rejected by heaven, disemboweled while alive. his compassion and humanity burned before his eyes, beheaded and quartered, the final, brutal erasure of the man, reduced to parts. Each step was designed to send a message, not to Wallace, but to those watching. This was to be theater, and in this theater, pain was the script, blood was the language, and William Wallace, defiant to the end, was cast not as a hero, but as a warning. The machinery of fear had been activated, and the people, some cheering, some silent, watched as it turned. The morning of August 23, 1305, broke warm and bright over London, but while the sun rose softly over the Thames, something far colder stirred within the city walls, a hunger for spectacle. Crowds began to gather before dawn. Vendors set up carts along the execution route, selling meat pies and ale. Children clambered onto barrels. Men jostled for position. For the people of London, this was not grief. This was entertainment, a carnival of cruelty, sanctioned by the crown. From the Tower of London, William Wallace was pulled into the light, stripped bare, bound to a wooden hurdle, and lashed behind a horse. The procession began, slowly, cruelly, his body scraped along the cobbled street, his skin torn by every bump and stone. Blood marked his path like a dark trail through the heart of empire. The route had been chosen deliberately, past marketplaces, guild halls, and churches, every corner of public life. It was not just the man that was being dragged, it was the idea he carried. And the message was clear: this is the cost of defiance. People cheered, some laughed, others simply watched in silence, unable or unwilling to look away. The English authorities had turned the moment into theater, and the crowd, unwittingly or not, had become its chorus. When the procession reached Smithfield, London's execution ground, a scaffold loomed above the mass of spectators. There, under the open sky, Wallace's final ordeal would begin. First, he was hanged, not to die, but to suffer. The rope was short, ensuring strangulation, not a broken neck. His body writhed, convulsing in that awful, helpless dance of the dying. But before unconsciousness could take him, the executioner cut him down. He was still alive, still breathing. And so the true horror began. Before a sea of watching eyes, Wallace was disemboweled, his abdomen sliced open, his internal organs removed one by one, and burned before him. Contemporary accounts speak of screams so raw they silenced even the loudest cheers, sounds not of a man, but of something primal, torn from the soul. His entrails, believed in the evil thought to hold emotion and humanity, were incinerated, as if the crown were not just killing Wallace, but erasing all feeling, all compassion, all trace of the man within. Through it all, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes, bloodshot, wide, unyielding, stared at some distant point beyond the scaffold. Some say he spoke, others say he only watched, but no one reported him begging. Not once. Finally, mercifully, the axe fell. His head was severed with a single blow. Blood splattered the boards. The crowd gasped, but the ceremony was not over. His body was quartered, each limb hacked free and lifted for the audience to see, not a man, but a message in pieces. His head, dipped in tar to preserve it, was later mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, visible to every traveller entering the city. His limbs were dispatched to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, each fragment a symbol, nailed high in public squares, meant to whisper to the people. This is what becomes of those who dream of freedom. But if that was the message Edward meant to send, it did not land as he expected. Because something strange happened that day, something Edward I had not foreseen. As Wallace's broken body was lifted, burned, surface, something else had taken root. Because what Edward failed to understand, what tyrants often fail to understand, is that violence cannot kill an idea. Not when that idea is born from suffering and carried by memory. In trying to erase Wallace, the English crown had engraved him into legend. Word of his death spread across Scotland like wind through heather. Not the sanitized version, not the king's official tale, but the truth. A man torn apart for refusing to bow. A man who endured the worst the world could offer without surrendering his cause. And in that, Wallace became something greater than a rebel. He became a martyr. His fate lit a fire in the hearts of those still clinging to Scotland's future. One of them was Robert the Bruce, a nobleman who had once compromised, once hesitated, but after Wallace's execution, something in Bruce changed. It said he saw in Wallace's suffering the true face of English rule, and the cost of inaction. Just 9 years later, at Bannockburn, Bruce would lead the Scots to a decisive victory. The battle wasn't just a military triumph, it was a spiritual one. And behind every sword raised that day stood the shadow of William Wallace, reminding them what was at stake. But the ripples of his death did not end at Scotland's borders. Across Europe, monarchs and scholars alike took note of the execution's cruelty. Chronicles recorded every detail, not to glorify, but to bear witness. In English abbeys, monks wrote of the crowd's frenzied cheers. In Scottish texts, Wallace was described as noble, even Christ-like in his suffering. Over time, legal thinkers and theologians began to question the spectacle. They wondered, could such punishment ever be just? Did even enemies deserve dignity and death? Centuries later, these questions would become part of the foundation for modern human rights law, the idea that justice must not only punish, but preserve humanity. And then there were the songs. In taverns and around hearths, his name returned, not as a traitor, but as the guardian, the brave heart, the man who would not yield. Stories softened his rough edges. His pain became poetry. His silence on the scaffold became strength. His death became a song of freedom. Even now, centuries on, Wallace's face adorned statues. His name lived in books and films. His voice imagined in speeches and oaths. Children learn of him not as a relic, but as a flame. Because while the English had scattered his body across the realm, they had unknowingly united the spirit of Scotland in a way no victory could. And somewhere, beneath the long grasses of Smithfield, where crowds once gathered to cheer his end, the earth remembered. Centuries had passed since William Wallace was led to the scaffold, since the crowds cheered and the flames consumed what remained of a man who would not kneel. And yet, his story remains. Why? Because some stories refuse to die, not because of their brutality, but because of what they reveal about power, about humanity, and about the cost of standing for something greater than oneself. Wallace's execution was meant to be final, a period at the end of a defiant sentence. Instead, it became a beginning, a seed planted in blood and fire that would bloom across generations. The very method meant to silence him, the rope, the blade, the fire, instead transformed him into a voice that still whispers. Freedom is never given, it is claimed, paid for, often in pain, but once it is spoken, it cannot be unsaid. In Wallace's death, we see a mirror, not just of medieval cruelty, but of our own capacity for darkness. Ordinary people gathered that day not because they were monsters, but because they had been told this was justice, that this man was dangerous, that watching him suffer was righteous. And so they watched, they cheered, they swallowed the cruelty as if it were necessary. That is perhaps the most chilling truth. Cruelty thrives best when dressed in ceremony. But Wallace never performed. He did not play his part in their spectacle. He did not plead. He did not recant. Even stripped of power, of protection, of flesh, he held onto principle. And that is why we remember. Because the human spirit, tested, broken, flayed, can still rise, can still inspire, can still haunt tyrants long after the body is gone. His story speaks not only to Scotland, but to anyone who has ever stood against the odds, who has ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, accept what is. It reminds us that the line between rebellion and righteousness is often drawn by those in power, and redrawn by those brave enough to resist. And perhaps most profoundly, Wallace's story reminds us that sometimes, the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but on scaffolds, in silence, in suffering, in the refusal to surrender the soul, even when the body is beyond saving. So tonight, if you close your eyes and listen closely, you may still hear the distant roar of the London crowd, you may feel the weight of chains, smell the smoke, see the shadow of a figure, tall, wounded, but unbent. And then you may hear, faint but steady, the whisper of something older than kings, stronger than empires. I have lived free, and I die unbroken. And in that whisper, you may find courage. You may find grief. You may find peace. But most of all, you may find yourself.